Ms. Wendland is an art historian and monument conservator. She studied in Hamburg and the beautiful city of Bamberg. She served as the state conservator for Saarland from 2002 to 2005 and for Saxony-Anhalt from 2005 to 2020. And since June 2020, she has been the managing director of the German National Committee for Monument Protection, and in this position also the conceptualizer of this event. And today she will talk about an old new topic concerning the parallelism of the discussions in 1973 and 2023. So Ms. Wendland, thank you very much for coming. During our pre-talk we realized that we need more reasons to invite you to Bamberg, and I'm sure that we will find them in the future. So thank you very much for being here. Yes, thank you, and I'm really happy to be here. After many years of break, I am finally back in Bamberg. I want to tell you about a side product of our work at the DRK office, and we started to clean up our cellar for practical reasons. And on the other hand, on the occasion of our 50th anniversary, we gathered a bit of information about our early history. So this is an ongoing project, and therefore I cannot present you with finished thesis, or can only give you a hypothesis for now. But it has already been shown that there is very interesting material from the debates of the early days, so from 1973 to 1975. And yes, that's what we will talk about today. And of course, we will also put this in relation to our current topic. So one note about that, at the moment I am only talking about the old Federal Republic of Germany, because as we all know, we are now a country that consists of two heritage preservation stories. And this is also a topic that we want to examine, namely what actually happened in East Germany in the former GDR regarding the European Heritage Protection Year of 1975. So please forgive me that today I'm only talking about the old Federal Republic of Germany. Interestingly, it seems that around 1973, very conservative forces and very progressive forces let's say a conservative figure like the former Minister of Education of Bavaria, Hans Mayer, but also young leftists, scientists, monument conservators, and politically active people from the legislative and executive bodies of the federal and state governments came together. So after very polarizing debates and further polarizing debates, after many protest voters and numerous civic initiatives from the middle of society, which you can follow in various social networks and newsletters, and currently there are also many institutions in heritage preservation and monument conservation that celebrate their 50th anniversary, and I myself am attending many 50-year celebrations. For example, I was recently at the Interessengemeinschaft Bauernhaus, who also turned 50 and come from the middle of society, which I will also talk about later. But also some state offices and some monument conservation laws are celebrating their 50th anniversary. So this year is a year of many 50th birthdays, and The result of this consensus, which will be described in more detail by us later, was changed goals, paradigms, and instruments or tools regarding the handling of our dwindling resources. So dwindling resources, cultural resources such as landscape, natural resources such as air, water, soil, or biodiversity, and cultural resources such as historical towns and cityscapes, monuments, and cultural assets, but also social resources. So this is interesting, and it is always mentioned together with milieus, affordable living spaces, and spaces for community gatherings. And it was also about energy resources, especially fossil energy sources like oil, coal, and gas in 1973. And we always talk about the oil crisis, but it was actually not a procurement crisis. It was a price crisis, but there was a concern that it could lead to a procurement crisis. So this all marked shift in these debates, which began in the late 60s and reached their peak in 1973. And these cannot be restricted to Germany only. So when you look at the documents of the Council of Europe, you find astonishing determinations by both the Council of Ministers and specialist committees, and this aspect also needs to be further investigated. Because it was a European movement clearly on the way to European heritage conservation. But yes, this was not planned from the beginning, and first there was the movement, and then we planned everything for this year. So we have to keep in mind that it's really a European issue, and it goes far beyond the current EU. For instance, the former Yugoslavia is included, and there are Eastern Bloc countries as well. So it's quite interesting. It's a quite interesting history during the Cold War era. In 1973, I think some of you are as old as I am or will still remember it. It was a turbulent year, and for me, there was sometimes just words, but they also left a deep impression on my memory. For example, the Yom Kippur War, which led to a price increase and an oil crisis. And in Germany, just as was done in the previous years, a strict approach was taken regarding that, unlike in other European countries. So, for example, there was this famous Sunday driving ban, which amazed everyone, and people walked on highways, and the images of the empty highways may have had a more lasting effect than the recent increase in gasoline prices. So, it has become deeply ingrained in the West German collective memory. And parallel to that, the Watergate scandal was unfolding in Washington. And although it wasn't that important for daily life, it was a major shock to political systems and democracies. The coup in Chile also had strong effects on West German society and intensified the polarized discussion between the right and the left. The red text shows you the keywords that were relevant during that time. So the red words, keywords that you can see on the slide. There was a severe economic crisis, and the structural change was in full swing, shifting away from the heavy industry to a service-oriented society. And the Vietnam War was still ongoing, and the signs of forest dieback were becoming apparent. Environmental pollution was also a significant concern. People were dissatisfied with the state of cities, and to some extent the villages as well. The debate on migration began, and there was also an examination of the Nazi era. So the question was asked, what did the father or grandfather actually do from 1933 to 1945? So that all began back in 1968, but it gained momentum during this time, and there was a sense of the end of modernity. So various insights were intertwined, and when you're in the midst of it, you don't know what the outcome of such a process will be. And however, it became increasingly clear that the promises of eternal progress could not be fulfilled, and that the collateral damage of getting rid of the old, which had already begun with the end of World War II, reached a new peak, thus creating alienation by focusing on the present and the future. And looking back at the photos today, indeed many cities didn't look much different from the historic districts in East Germany around 1990. So we always have to adjust well to the fact that there was a great need and a huge backlog of renovations in cities and historical villages with historic buildings. So they were dirty, ugly, and what was newly built was partly simple, banal, and remained this way. They were also noisy, and in many places they were no longer considered livable, even in the sense of that time. And moreover, the cultural landscapes were at risk of being lost or overrun to such an extent that alarms were raised, and the environment was indeed heavily polluted. So around 1973, a cultural change began, which we may not notice so much from when looking back to it today, but it was quite strong, and it was more of an urban phenomenon, but there was a consistent rediscovery of the pre-modern era. And regarding that, there was a wave called the nostalgia wave, which was a broad rediscovery of history, and partly also through historical workshops. For example, some ideas also came from Scandinavian countries, and it is important to note that no history is too small not to deal with it. So these had a significant impact on heritage preservation, museum activities, and other forms of engaging with history. So I'm talking here about flea markets, second-hand shops, pubs with antiques, but also old-time jazz and all the do-it-yourself projects. And here we're already getting into the topics of upcycling and recycling. So, for example, taking furniture from the bulky waste, painting and reusing it, that wasn't normal before. And it was a counter movement also of the younger generation against the older one. Another case was renting old buildings cheaply and renovating them yourself in the city or in the countryside. And teachers, for example, bought abandoned farms in urban areas or beyond and lived there in more or less collective forms of life. So around 1973, those of you who grew up during that time will still know this from their mothers, that themes like easy care were really relevant back then. So everything should be as easy to wash as possible. And because of that, recycle was an important material, and clothing was designed to be easily washable and not require ironing either. So back then it was all about creating a clean world, and rightfully so, as women's work should become easier. Back then it was also generally considered women's work, so the care work was considered women's work. But this return to old things was also a rebellion against the older generation, which perhaps wanted everything easy to maintain and clean for other reasons. Because the question arose again, so the one I mentioned before, what did my father do during the Nazi era? So this goes very strongly into the relevant disciplines of historical research. So the so-called march through the institutions of the 1968 generation resulted in public debates about National Socialism and its consequences. However, the major boost only came in the 1980s. It started in the 70s, however. And These are disputes, conflicts in historical disciplines about critical contemporary history, microhistory, as well as local history. And there is also much enthusiasm and experimentation for these new forms of grassroots history. So writing history about the so-called common people, which also enters the field of monument preservation and practice. So city planning is almost a driving force behind this entire development, and we must clearly acknowledge monument conservators who come from art history. The big wave and the major paradigm shift from urban renewal through demolition to urban renewal through preservation is the responsibility of city planners. And the art historians and monument conservators are somewhat following behind that. So the previous urban tramway model of post-war modernism is strongly questioned here. Things like car-friendly cities, row housing, and large green spaces are being replaced in favor of revitalizing existing structure, and this replacement process takes about 20 years, but it still began during that time. And in monument preservation, including newly established offices or expanded offices, young researchers with different concepts come into play. It is also interesting, as I mentioned before, that many citizen initiatives were founded during this time, mainly focusing on the preservation of cities. So some of them are still quite contentious to this day, and that is certainly a good thing. So these are the major associations that still exist in Nuremberg, in Lübeck, Regensburg, in Frankfurt. And as I recently learned, the Nuremberg Altstadt Friends, so one of these associations, have 5,000 members, which is a lot. And they may be a bit different today, even in their approaches, but they still continue to be a citizen movement for the old town, for monuments, and for urban history. And it's interesting because in the fight for houses, the far left meets the traditionalists. So some occupy the houses, and others may be a bit upset about it, but they might still be happy about it as well. So initiatives come from two political sides here to honor and preserve the heritage, not just as valuable monuments, but also as living spaces. And they begin to oppose area renovation and large new construction projects. The first step out of this misery of demolition is the Urban Development Funding Act, which wasn't initially very successful because it also supported area renovations. And however, aspects such as preliminary investigations and citizen participation were already introduced, as were the first small renewal projects. In official monument preservation, there was also a paradigm shift. So suddenly previously completely ignored building types became worthy of preservation and also capable of being monuments, of reaching the status of monuments. For example, in industrial heritage. So the first well-known example is the Zeche Zollern 2, which you can see here on the picture. It is in Dortmund, and this was listed for demolition and is now an icon. So yeah, it was already on the demolition list, which is almost unimaginable for us today. Worker settlements were put under protection, and there was also a movement. So there were even books that said monument protection is social policy, and it wasn't just about the shell, it was about those who lived inside of it. And discussions were held about comprehensive protection for area monuments, and first experiments were also initiated. Moreover, there was a focus on the then young monuments such as historicism. The 1920s were all learning projects, but during this time the offices also began to open up and share their knowledge. And they published working papers, produced public magazines, and issued guidelines. And these were all new steps back then. Monument protection laws were enacted where there were none, and this was mostly in the old federal states. Staff was hired, and protection authorities were also established at the municipal level, and there was a novelty in many places where municipalities were also made responsible for their assets. So, however, there was still a need for a push. There were many individual initiatives, and the surge of dissatisfaction was respected by politicians. And even though there were still few female politicians at the time, there was a wave, and that's what we still need to research a bit more intensively. So, who was responsible for what? In any case, the Federal Ministry of the Interior was involved, and to this day there is no Federal Ministry of Culture. So at that time the Federal Cultural Matters were under the Ministry of the Interior. There was also the Conference of Ministers of Education and Cultural Affairs, as well as municipalities and various associations. They all met and discussed that something had to be done, also regarding monument protection and preservation at the federal level. At that time, it was fitting that in 1975 the Council of Europe declared European monument preservation, and in preparation for that the German National Committee was founded, and there were many national committees in Europe, including a German one, which was initially intended as a temporary working group, but then continued to exist after some trouble and back and forth. And it was expanded into a PR and monument preservation organization, as well as a mediation organization and a professional network. And this German National Committee, for example, organized the exhibition for the year 1975. So what you can see here is a poster that we probably have seen quite often at all events this year. And it began a sharing of knowledge with the professional network, and also a sharing of knowledge with the citizens. Meaning that publications were issued, and I can only point out again that back then there was no Wikipedia, no Google, so until the 1980s, during our student years, gathering information on monument protection and preservation was quite exhausting and difficult. And the German National Committee also tried to help ensure that everyone in the Federal Republic could have a similar level of information if they wanted to. So yes, to this day we offer our publications for free, and you can order them or find them on our website and have them delivered or download them. Over the decades, the thematic fields also reflect the major clusters of these subsequent years. It was about the unusual and the then new monument types such as gardens, cemeteries, industrial heritage, urban monument preservation, tax relief, monument preservation as an economic factor. And it was also about creating awareness for young monuments. And we are still doing that today. We have, for example, just released a volume about the 1980s. So the future of religious buildings is also, or also so-called uncomfortable monuments, is important here. So we have an award that is given every year as a thank you for their commitment, but also to draw attention to monuments and monument initiatives. So we still organize student workshops to attract young colleagues and future colleagues to engage with monuments. And for 50 years we have been engaged in networking activities within committees and expert working groups, because networking must always be maintained and developed across generations. So here, the slide 2023, the public interests are firmly established but in competition. This actually began as a whole movement, and Ingrid Scheuermann has already pointed out that nature conservation, environmental protection, social urban development, the rights of disabled people, monument preservation and many others are now relatively side by side, but sometimes still even a bit against each other. And bridging these highly regulated areas is not always easy, as you know. So those of you who are already working in practice and theory, or will be doing so in the future, will experience this as well. So here, 2023 learns from 1973 the social overall objectives, meaning preserving natural and built resources, which are established and solidified through extensive regulations. However, this gives rise to situations of competition and conflicts of objectives, as we are currently experiencing in the media and politics. In February and March, it felt like the energy transition was only stalling in one place, and this is the monument preservation, as these 3% of monument roofs are not included. And there was a popular topic in the media, but as we've heard, monument preservation is already a contribution to conserving resources, and these conflicts of objectives can be resolved. And we have, in fact, been solving them for 50 years. It is nothing new to discuss insulation and renewable energy in relation to monuments, and now there's a wave to eliminate exceptional regulations. And that's difficult because, in principle, a spirit of compromise should grow. And I'm almost done here. I'll get to the last slides. So what I intend to say is that we need to learn on both sides, and I'm currently experiencing, as you probably are too, a very consistent paradigm shift, which is partly forced by, but also partly based on conviction, for example. And now I'll get back to solar panels again. These are never monument friendly, but they can be made monument compatible, and they can help compensate for insulation deficits. And not always, but sometimes, as is the case with the Sonnenschloss in Bamberg in Saxony-Anhalt, they can provide economic support for monuments. And if this solar entrepreneur hadn't bought this castle, then it wouldn't exist today, or it would only be a ruin. And now instead it is a thriving mixed operation of business, tourism, services, and also residential spaces. So we need to see if certain new building standards do not destroy more historic monuments more than they help. We've been trying to do that for decades, and now we need to take a new approach and think differently. So that's why the German National Committee currently has a focus on monument preservation as active climate protection. Yes, the future of church buildings and also standards and methodology of contemporary monument mediations are all interconnected topics. And here is so you can find all information on the www.dnk.de website. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the rest of the day. Dear Ms. Wendland, thank you very much for this exciting insight into what it was like 50 years ago, and I believe that this opens up many points that we should consider and